Okay. Okie dokie.
All right.
Lots to talk about.
Hello, Scream. Hello, Screaming. Screamers.
Hello. What up,
Fellow
everybody?
live scream.
Lots to talk. Hopefully, no one threatens to behead us today.
Oh, I think we will. I think with this topic, I think for this topic, like, let's see how many people I'm gonna have to ban or mute or whatever.
Oh god.
Hopefully no
Oh
one.
god. Yeah.
Hopefully everyone can be respectful, but it's kind of tough. Like this is, and this is also what I wanted to mention a little bit more. But like probably the most worldly divisive topic.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. There's like so many levels to it. You have like ethnic groups, religion, geopolitics. It all just kind of lumps
Yeah,
into this fun little marble sandwich here.
yeah.
That's so true. Yeah. Yeah, like if someone threatened to I forget the episode. It was something about Saudi Arabia, and if that one was divisive, this one's really divisive. So
For
fun
real.
stuff.
Um. Okay, so we don't need this one right now. Okay.
Ooh, graphs.
Yeah, but all right, man. Well, shit. Do you want an intro? Do you want me to intro? We could just vibe it out.
So are we gonna start? So we're starting with what do you want to start with?
Maybe like CDC masks just to open it up.
Sure, sure, that sounds good. Yeah, so something kind of less intense to start off, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's do that. That sounds good. Sure, I could do a little introduction for that. I got a really cheesy way to introduce it, so
Yeah. All right. Let's do it. Go for it.
good to go.
Yes. I guess we will just record the whole thing.
Sure. Yeah. Just split it up later is fine. Yeah.
All right. Cool. I can try and keep a note as
Voices
well.
are
Oh
voices are
yeah.
good.
Yeah,
Just
voices
want
seem
to make
fine.
sure.
Yeah, voices are
Cool.
fine. Let's just try a little test.
Yeah.
So let's do a little test. I'm going to speak at normal speaking volume like I'm talking to you and then go ahead.
Masks are off, everybody. Well, not really, actually, but yeah, kind of in a
Kind
fun way.
All right, let me check that real quick. Oh man, I'm running out of space, bro. I need to fucking
I
clean
know I've
I
said that issue.
I'm going to need to clean up my computer.
Yeah.
So let's do a little test. I'm going to speak at normal speaking volume like I'm talking
Yeah,
to you and then
I
go
just
ahead.
had that epiphany too. Masks are
It's
off,
like shit.
everybody.
There's
Well, not really. Actually.
lots going on here.
Yeah, those video files.
Right. I've had to end up deleting some of the really old ones. I hope
Yeah,
that's
no,
okay.
I definitely understand.
I hope that's okay. Yeah.
No, yeah. I mean, they're kind of technically out there, right? So
Yeah.
I guess unless we get completely like banned from this Israel Palestine episode.
Right. Um. Okay. Boom.
Bam, bam.
Sorry. Okay. Hold on.
No, no,
Okay.
you're
Cool.
good.
Cool. Okay. Because I was at the point where like I don't think I would have been able to record this if I didn't delete shit. Like. Um. Okay. So now we're good. And our voices sound fine. I mean, my mic's not the best, but I'm so tired of switching out and having all these issues that I think I'm just gonna stick with it for now. If that's cool.
Sounds fine to me.
Okay. Cool. Oh, okay. Recording in three, two, one.
So, just like the hit Future song Mask Off, the CDC has also said that vaccinated Americans can take off their masks. So, welcome to the Tonic Accord. And today we're going to start off with kind of talking about some COVID updates, like the CDC's new mask changes, vaccines, and more. So, Drew, are you going to be walking around LA without your mask indoors?
Well, not indoors as much as I would want to. Yeah, this is where it's weird because I want to. I'm fully vaccinated. I'm past 2 weeks after my second dose. Like, I'm ready to go. But and the CDC is it's telling people that if you are fully vaccinated, that the vaccines work even against the variants, and that you can start to resume a normal life. However, the confusing thing is, where do state governments and local governments lie, right? Like, I think immediately after this, some states were rolling back their mask requirements, but California is not, and in private businesses as well are going to still have to decide for themselves, do they want masks, right? So, whether it's Walmart saying they're going to reassess some of their mask policies, or Trader Joe's and stuff, it just depends. So where I am, what up, RoboMax224? How's it going, bud? So where I am, you know, everyone's still wearing masks indoors. But I do think that, this is a big step, and it's a big thing. Like the CDC saying, hey, it's time to actually really change your thinking. And though it does seem like it was kind of like just rushed out there, like I was listening to an NPR daily podcast about this, and they had mentioned that Joe Biden only knew about this change from the CDC like the morning of the same day. Like, he didn't have time to prepare, right? It seemed like the CDC kind of just sprung this on everybody. But maybe that's kind of what you need to really just kind of like let people know, to kind of change your thinking of like, okay, we've been bunkered down and hunkered down for a year. Now the reality is, if you're vaccinated, you don't have to be like that.
Yes, definitely. And yeah, when I first saw it, to be honest, I think what it was like last Wednesday or something, I was just like, interesting, because I feel like it's been such a glacial movement of changes with masks, and then just bam, like just bam, everything's just hitting like that. And I feel like there's two like kind of thought patterns on this. And I actually am a little bit hesitant about them doing this so quick. But I do see what you're saying there. Like, Bill Kristol also was on the Bulwark, was kind of using that point where he's like, this could be a strategy to show people, that if they're hesitant about the vaccine, if they get it, there is an end in sight. And under that way, I mean, it's true, it works. And yeah, like you said, the vaccines are safe. And if you're trying to get people to take the vaccine, I think you should give this positivity, because for months it was kind of like, well, even a year after you get vaccinated, you still might need to mask up. And, it probably turned off a lot of hesitant people. You know what I mean? But this seems to be a little more optimistic. My issue, though, is that, like, CDC Director Walensky was on Meet the Press with Chuck Todd on Sunday, and I just watched a little portion of it. But she was basically like, people are going to have to be responsible and be honest and do what they think is right. And let's be honest, the last year has showed us that that's pretty difficult for a lot of people. And I've already seen things about, fake COVID vaccine cards. There's like a nurse, I think it was in New Mexico, who got arrested for stealing vaccine cards from the CVS or something like that. And so we're going to see this, I think, just kind of this snowball of people trying to pretend they're vaccinated so they don't have to wear a mask. How do you enforce it? This kind of puts, small businesses, probably especially, at kind of this heightened risk or just heightened chaos of like trying to get people to prove they're vaccinated or not. So like, I agree that I think it's a good direction and it probably gives some good optimism, but I think the rollout was a little shaky. Obviously time will tell, because there are still, like, I think I saw that, I think it was 25% of Republicans still won't get vaccinated, which is okay for herd immunity, but we do need more people to get vaccinated. So yeah, that's just kind of where I
Yeah,
stand.
but obviously the thing with those Republicans is they're making it a show of it's some
Right.
it's political grandstanding somehow for not getting vaccinated, which is ridiculous. But no, that's but I mean, it's interesting, the response, because like I have heard criticism, like I have heard that criticism that it was too much too soon or whatever. You can't trust people, but it's interesting that like the White House has seemed to adopt it really quick. Like the White House
Right.
is no longer has a mask policy, because everyone in the White House is vaccinated. Um, and Joe Biden's having meetings with vaccinated leaders without masks in closed doors, right? And so and his press secretary is without mask, and her staff. So they're really, they're really showing that they're like, yeah, yeah, we're taking this CDC thing seriously, and the CDC is saying that I see like that it's just based off the science, that within the last 2 weeks, even from their previous update on mask rules, they found more science to suggest that vaccines are even more effective than we had thought against the variants. I think that's a big thing. Oh, here we go already coming in with "fuck is real." We're not on
Right.
that topic yet. Also, you spelled Israel wrong, but we'll get there. Right, but right now we're on masks, and the reality is the vaccines are proven to be better on the variants than we had expected, and so I think that's what pushed things along was like we don't have to worry about some of the things we were worried about a month ago, as well as the Pfizer going to be good against the Brazilian one or whatever. Now we know that it is. We know that these vaccines are very effective, to the point where even kids can now get them in a lot of states. And so yes, I'm hoping that there's enough people that are responsible that those anti-vax communities won't matter enough in the grand scheme. And I also heard those news stories about like some guy to CVS selling fake COVID vaccine cards. I have to imagine though that those are rare, right? Like that became a story because that's crazy. That guy probably
Right.
immediately lost his job. Like I have to imagine like there's no way that that's happening at a large scale. I don't think. So and hopefully just like my state surprisingly, like California only has like 11% of people had some vaccine hesitancy. So if you get 9 out of 10, I mean, you're golden. And that's California that I know more liberal, but still has a lot of people that I think I figure it would have been higher than that. So I'm hoping that really soon, even like private companies, like going to the grocery store will lift the mask mandates, and we can really start to get back to normal.
Yes. No. No. Absolutely. And like, yeah, I do agree. That's probably a rare case of the person's. I don't think we're going to see every pharmacist stealing vaccine cards, no doubt. Though, again, like it goes back to my main issue with this, though, and I'm not going to stay on it too long. But it's just that there is no like. Basically, what I think they should have done is at least have criteria like you need to present X, Y, and Z or something, because there are going to be people who are just going to say, "Hey, I'm vaccinated." I'm not talking about in California because you're right. Here in California, it's probably a different case. But I could see in certain states, I could see that being a little bit different. Turning it just a little bit while we're on COVID, though, what do you think about Biden announcing that they're going to sell over 20 million, or not sell, but give over 20 million doses of Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson and Johnson to the world? To me, that's great news because I was reading something in The Economist that Canada ordered 13 vaccinations per person, and the UK 9, because they were so afraid of which vaccine's going to work, which is not, and so states like us, the UK, Canada, we've basically stockpiled vaccines. So good thing. How do you think that's going to roll out?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great. I mean, credit to both administrations. Both Biden and Trump's administration were really good at buying buying basically reserving vaccines early from these companies. Um, and that is why the United States is way ahead on the vaccinations, as well as an effective rollout and making these mass vaccination sites and making it free and everything, right? So now that we are like so ahead, I think, of the world, why not, right? Why not use millions and millions of vaccines to give out to other people? Again, I mean, one, morally, I do think it's the right thing to do. But then two, even if you want to think selfishly, it's selfishly a good thing to do because the more you vaccinate the world, the less people come to your country with COVID, right? Like it's a feedback loop of the healthier everyone else is, the healthier the people, coming to our country are. So I think it's absolutely a good thing, and I mean, I don't really see how anyone could think it's a bad thing. The only argument that it would be bad is that they haven't vaccinated enough Americans first. But the reality is we have, and if you haven't gotten a vaccine in America at this point, it's because it's your choice because you just don't want to.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. No, it's good to see, and I honestly think it's good for the economy of the world as well.
Yeah,
Like more people vaccinated means more people going back to work,
yeah,
less civil unrest, all of that. So yeah, it's going to be cool. I'm glad Biden did that because for a while he was pushing for getting rid of intellectual property rights, which. I mean, that's a whole other conversation, but I think it's too late. That would take like probably close to a year to actually get that implemented. So I'm
right.
I'm glad they went this route. So yeah. What else is on your mind this week? I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if you have anything else on masks and COVID, but
Not massive COVID. Yeah. Before we dive into the really tough stuff, where we're gonna start seeing some swear words thrown around, but before that, maybe like the UFOs, man. UFOs are getting big hot spot in news. and to the point where it's like mainstream, like no longer just like History Channel stuff, where you have the Pentagon, and the U.S. Defense Department both admitting that they exist, that unidentified aerial phenomenon (UAPs) exist, and we don't know what they're doing, and important countries sort of no, we're getting to it. We're getting to it, man. We're getting to different topics. We have a lot to cover. Um, anyway, so yeah, what's cool is like it's a topic that you and I have both been interested in for a while, just for fun and just because we've it's a fascinating topic, but it was always on the fringe, and now we're seeing it become a mainstream topic covered by the New York Times, the New Yorker, and now 60 Minutes. And
Yeah.
I think it's pretty fascinating. Like, what do you think, man? Like, what? Do you ever think this day would even come?
No, like I listen to a lot of Joe Rogan, and he brings on a lot of ex-military, ex-Air Force pilots, and they all joke about how they basically were silent for decades about this stuff because they'd be laughed at. They would be considered a complete loon. And I honestly never saw it either. I mean, I've had some, I think I've seen a UFO in my life or two. And if I told just your average, like, working Joe, he'd probably make fun of me. And so, like, I think you and I were talking about this yesterday. It seems like that Overton window of what is possible to talk about
Hmm.
has kind of opened up. But now there's an alarming thing about this too, which is obviously all kind of anecdotal and speculative, but it seems like these encounters are getting like closer to people and closer to our technology. And I think they're like this is again a theory, so don't condemn me for this, but it seems like the Pentagon's maybe talking about it because it's harder to cover these things up in a way because like we've had reports of these things getting close to our nuclear facilities, close to military installments, Guantanamo. They used to be kind of out in the middle of Nebraska or something. But it seems like they're getting closer and closer to kind of our infrastructure, our military, our technology, and that's either by chance or kind of alarming, depending where you go with that. But yeah, it's really fascinating, man. And I think like RoboMax here says, aliens existing is inevitable. I agree, but there's that idea of would we ever actually be coming into contact with them, and maybe we are.
Well, certainly the credibility of this kind of phenomenon is changing because of like right here, 60 Minutes talking to Navy
Right.
pilots that not only saw in like as a group, like four of them saw a UAP up close and do incredible movements that they can't explain, but then went on years later in the late 2000s, early 2010s to be a part of a whole Pentagon program looking at UAPs. If the That sounds pretty serious to me. Like that doesn't sound like, the crazy farmer with the shotgun with his cow getting abducted. Like these are like Navy pilots that were called on to the Pentagon to give data and information and look into the phenomenon. Like obviously now the government's taking it seriously. Um and the media, I think, is taking it seriously. What's interesting is I watched an interview with a reporter from the New Yorker who did a lot of coverage on this phenomenon and the media around it. And he talked about how, like that Overton window conversation, how it actually wasn't taboo or fringe to talk about it but in from like the 40s to the 70s. So post World War II, 50s, 60s, it was a lot of like mainstream coverage, like front page news sometimes, and people would ask government officials about UFOs and stuff like that. And that's where we get all the famous, oh, it's a weather balloon and it's the Russians, right? And I think something happened in the 70s where maybe the government plan was to just completely deny or I don't know if it was like a planned thing or just maybe a cultural shift where too many of those Hollywood B movies were made that people were uninterested in UFOs. But like at one point, it was not taboo to talk about it, and then from 1970 until about 2015, it was taboo again, and it was only late night channels on the late night shows at 1 a.m. on the History Channel. But now it's back to being like it's 60 Minutes, New York Times, like respected journalists are investigating this, and military people are talking about it, and Defense Department is taking it seriously. It's like whoa, damn.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, I mean, if you just see some of these videos, the movement of these things, just the way they seem to defy physics in a lot of these circumstances, I mean, that's always been kind of what brings me back to it is, some of them, there could be drones involved in some of this.
Sure,
I
of
mean, I'm sure
course.
that not all of them are UFOs or UAPs. But like, obviously the Russians and the Chinese are not that ahead of us on something so fundamental as like gravity and physics and like jet propulsion and stuff like that.
Hmm.
So, and it just, it's really fascinating. I am curious, just, thinking ahead here. I'm curious if there's a reason why the government tried so hard to cover it up. I like to kind of put I usually don't like conspiracies, but when I get into aliens, I love to put on my tinfoil hat, and I do wonder if, because you're right, there was this kind of like, I think Roswell in a way was kind of the big like changing point where the military reported right after that crash that it was a UFO or some unknown object, right, and then they changed it to a weather balloon, and it seems like since then there's been this kind of escalation of that. I would think it's maybe the Cold War, that maybe had us so focused on like securing intelligence that maybe we didn't want to keep anything open. But yeah, I think it's really interesting to see, and the fact that it's coming from Navy pilots, Air Force pilots, like I just happen to think these type of people are pretty credible. It takes a lot of long work and a lot of education, and you kind of have to be pretty straight edge to do those type of jobs. It's not like you have, yeah, like a cattle farmer in Nebraska or something. So it's going to be interesting to see. Like, I also wonder if Trump being president maybe brought some of this to light, just because maybe there was a fear that he was just going to spill the beans. Because let's be honest, that guy talks about everything. So maybe it was better to beat him to the story. I don't know.
You know, it is weird though. It's got this weirdly I mean, makes sense because it's not. I mean, I don't know why it wouldn't be, but it is weirdly bipartisan. Like you have Harry Reid, a Democrat, who's super fascinated and launched programs into looking into getting reports, and then you also have like Senator Marco Rubio, who's
Right.
fascinated with this, and you know and they both talk about how in the halls of Congress, a lot of people used to snicker and giggle about the topic, but they were the ones who were like, "No, this is serious." And like, think about it; it is serious. If you really don't know what the hell's going on, just drop the aliens. Even without the aliens perspective, if you have someone has the capabilities to basically juke and outclass your best fighter jets by incredible measures. You want to know what the hell that is? Like, what the hell is that? And then, especially if it is aliens, we should probably figure out what's going on. So, yeah, I mean, the zeitgeist feels like it's changing around the topic, which is pretty cool.
Hmm. And yeah, I just it'll be funny to see what happens. Well, not really funny. It could be funny. It could be terrifying. Who knows? But I'm curious. I think there's something with our oceans too, because a lot of these seem to be coming out of the ocean. So that brings up some other questions. Oceans kind of the unknown frontier on Earth. We really couldn't map out the oceans.
I
Brings
hear,
up some questions, man.
I hear a lot about like lights going in and out of the ocean between LA and Catalina. Like
Hmm.
people see him and go like they'll like it's just what I hear, it's just what I hear. Who knows, man? Who knows? But it's certainly like dope that the conversations around it is changing. And I also saw a funny comment on Reddit. It was someone said this is vindication for all the like weird drunk uncles that were like, you
Great.
ever
Here's
think
what we
about
need.
yeah, you ever think about you have aliens, man? Like now they're all like, I'm telling you, the government's admitting it now. Like how many dudes out in the desert in a trailer with the little bent satellite thing have now gotten completely validated by this?
Oh boy. Just what we need is validation for the crazy uncle at Thanksgiving. But
All right.
yeah.
Well, should we dive into our main topic of the day?
Yes. Yes. I think
Okay.
I think we should.
All right. So this is probably I mean, not probably, definitely the more serious and least fun topic, but important one to talk about. So for those just tuning in, this is the Tonic Accord podcast. Alex and I are both, political junkies, as well as work in various fields regarding politics, and we're going to be taking a look at what's going on, in Israel and Gaza, in Palestine and Israel, how these two nations are fighting each other, how they've been at odds, what's going on, and as well as we want to dive into kind of the coverage around it and how that might play a role in what we're seeing being reported. So, yeah, it's obviously a really sensitive topic, right? It's not an easy one to talk about. I think off the bat, we're not going to claim to know the answers or to have we don't claim to know what the solution to this is. That's not really what I want. I'm personally not going to try and solve this problem today, but there are important things to talk about and important things to remember when you're looking at a complex issue like this. And that's what we want to dive into, and we want to give some nuance to maybe something that doesn't have a lot of nuance online. So, before you start typing 15 messages really quick right now calling me whatever slant, just keep that in mind, that like this is a super complex problem, that not everything you see or hear might be 100% accurate, and that we really want to just do our best to get a good picture of what's going on so that we can find a real solution. With that in mind, Alex, how are you doing, man? And um, yeah, give us a little update on what is going on over in the Middle East.
Good to hear from you, Drew. Yeah, I'm doing all right. It's been kind of a hectic doozy of a week, but staying sane. Pretty excited for summer. Looks like it's going to be a good summer, so that's all I can ask for. And unless we get abducted by those UAPs or whatever they are, so.
Right.
But yeah, you're right. This is a complicated subject, and just to kind of add a little caveat to what you said is we both had a professor at Chapman back in the day, and I took a few Middle East classes with him, and he was an expert. Like this was kind of his topic was Israel and Palestine. And even after all of his experience, he still, couldn't come up with a solution. So it's a really complicated issue. And specifically in this case, I just want to start with the background of this specific one because this is the worst violence since 2014.
Right.
It's pretty bad that it's only been 7 years since the last time there was this bad of violence. But basically, it seems like there was like kind of a perfect storm scenario that happened here, where Ramadan, for people who don't know, doesn't fall on a date like say Independence Day or Christmas or whatever. Ramadan kind of changes every year, and because I've been in Morocco when it was on June something, or it's the month of June, but this time it was in April, which coincided, unfortunately, with the Israeli independence, like kind of national holiday. So you had two opposing groups that are sharing a very small piece of land who had a big holiday during the same period of time. And from what I've gathered, there was a mosque, which is a super famous mosque in Israel called the Aqsa Mosque, and the Arab Israelis were celebrating Ramadan there. Not celebrating, they had their religious things going on. And what happened is the Israeli authorities under the president, who is different than Netanyahu, he basically ordered to send authorities there to unplug the speakers from the mosque to quiet it down because there was, Israeli celebrations going on, Jewish celebrations going on at the same time. And that started things and it led to rock throwing, riots, and some clashing. But then at the same time, there were police raids throughout the city and other mosques. And then the court inside of Israel was reviewing a judgment to evict Palestinians from the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood. And then, at the same time, Muhammad Abbas, the kind of leader of Palestine, though he's not really the leader, and we'll get to that later, but he basically postponed elections, and he's really unpopular. I've heard people jokingly say that he's still in the 17th year of his first 4-year term. So he's an autocrat, a really bad autocrat, who really hasn't done much for the Israeli people. And he postponed elections, and I would just say kind of this whole culmination of events led to Israel kind of coming down with an iron fist. And I just off the bat want to just say, and then I'll turn it over to you, is that I do think Israel has acted too violent against the Palestinians, but it's way more complicated than that. But I do think Israel needs to be called out by the U.S. specifically because the U.S. is one that they might actually listen to. But I do think the Palestinians also deserve some condemnation as well.
Yeah, it's incredibly complicated. So there is those spark ups, right? Is the issue with the mosque and the Ramadan celebration. Um, you know, like that that the Israeli side is they felt it was some security threat from the gathering of people. I think the Palestinians feel that if you're having a religious celebration and especially where they were is it's like the third most important holy site in Islam, then and then the Israelis force you out of your religious celebration. That's a deeply personal and cultural thing that you can then feel that like they obviously don't welcome our beliefs or our religion or our being here, right? So that even if even if there is some argument of, oh, there's too crowded or something, breaking up a religious ceremony is a bag of worms that obviously pisses people off, and justifiably. Look at how mad people were when you can't, go to church for months here in America. How many churches protested that, right? Like, it's deeply cultural and rooted in people's identity. So to do something like that is obviously going to spark anger. Um, and then yes, there's also that evictions, and the thing is that the evictions of the neighborhoods is a pattern. It's something that you can watch. There's a great Louis Theroux documentary from the BBC. He goes around with a Jewish developer in that area, talking about like how he's building all these beautiful suburban homes in like Palestinian land, and he talks about this eviction process, and it doesn't it's dirty, it's complex, and it's rough. Like, people lose their livelihoods because of Israeli law, and preferring Israelis. So that obviously, and so that history of like evicting Palestinians goes on for a long time, and that's because of the Israeli law that after 1947 is allowing Israelis to reclaim land and property lost from the Arab-Israeli War. However, 750,000 Palestinians were also misplaced by those wars, and there's no legal recourse for them to reclaim lands. So that's where that, like, you can see how even if there's some legitimate claim to this land, multiple people are being treated differently by the government and have different claims to sometimes the same land. It gets very complex. So I do think that there's things that Israel should have done differently to avoid angering Palestinians, but it's obviously worth saying that Hamas launching rockets at innocent Israelis is not a good response. And things like the Iron Dome, the defense that Israel has against Hamas's rockets, should be there. I'm fine with U.S. taxpayer money to build things like the Iron Dome to prevent rockets from harming innocent lives. That's a good thing. What I don't like is then when Israel comes back with airstrikes that hurt innocent lives. It's fighting fire with fire. And when Hamas is based on this narrative that Israel wants to kill every Palestinian, and then Israel does kill Palestinians, Hamas's narrative and recruiting apparatus gets stronger, and the conflict gets deeper entrenched. It's a pattern. It's like neither side wants to de-escalate. Both sides feel justified in their escalations, and then it leads to just chaos.
Very astute point. Yeah, like it takes two to tango, and I like honestly, if you actually read, not you specifically, but if our listeners actually read into like the day-to-day life of people, Arab Jews, I mean not Arab Jews, Arab Israelis and Jewish Israelis, the actual like day-to-day coercion in society is not that bad. Like there's a lot of like shared, public gatherings. People get along for the most part. For the most part. So I'm sure I'm going to get backlash on that. But the problem is both sides don't, like you said, they just want to escalate. Benjamin Netanyahu, in my opinion, is the worst thing possible for Israel. He is truly becoming slowly an autocratic nationalist who
Yes.
kind of just sees growing Israel as the only way. Now, a caveat: if you see some of the hate amongst the Arab community towards Israel, you could understand why he's so defense heavy and so like combative against, their surrounding territories. They're in a region of the world where most of their neighbors are not fond of them. Now, obviously that goes back to the historical decision to, annex Israel basically there. But again, like you talked about with these settlements too, it violates international law.
Yes.
And to be super critical of Israel for a moment, the Linkub government, which Netanyahu is, I guess, the leader of, is actively trying to make sure that the two-state solution doesn't happen. They want to keep building these settlements and putting Israeli Jews in there. And so one day, if there were ever talks about actually trying to get a two-state solution, meaning a Palestinian Muslim state and a Jewish Israel state, it would be harder if there's already settlements there. So it's clearly a strategic thing, and I think it was a politician out of East Jerusalem who basically said that. He's like, we are building settlements to make sure that the Palestinians can never have this land. And that is problematic to me. Like, that is very problematic to me. My issue, though, again, is that Hamas is not a political body. It is a terrorist group that actively uses their own civilians as collateral damage. And then for some reason, and we'll get into this later, Hamas does have sympathy in the media. There is sympathy towards the Palestinian cause without actually talking about what Hamas does. And I remembering like in classes back at Chapman, that always came up is Hamas will use Palestinian Muslims as collateral. They get killed by the Jews, and then it just escalates the situation worse. And I think also the problem is that the Israelis are backed by the West. They're backed by the Americans. So they have better technology. So the problem is that there is a disparity between almost second-class citizens who maybe sometimes start the problem, but Israel's always going to win the fight with big guns.
Yeah, it's asymmetrical, right? So
Mm-hmm.
there's great points you made there. Is one is, Hamas might have a political entity, which they do, but they, I think time and time again have shown to be an Islamist jihadist terrorist group. Um, you know, I think there's photos of them in there. A Hamas fighter inside an underground tunnel in Gaza in August 2014 during a tour by Reuters journalists. They stash weapons in civilian areas. So what you're saying is that Hamas understands that the loss of civilian life helps their cause, and can get reported on as Israel killing innocent civilians, which is true, is what happens. And so they're hoping that, so they put the claim is that Hamas puts weapon stashes and weapon caches and targets that Israel wants to destroy near civilians, so that if Israel wants to destroy them, they have to blow up civilians, and then that in turn betters the narrative for Hamas to recruit and have international support, and things like that. But then you also make a very good point that this war is asymmetrical. It is not two nations of equal economic power and military might fighting it out on a battlefield. It is Israel has the largest recipient of U.S. military aid, and on its own accord has a very substantive and effective military. Known for winning the 7 Days War very quickly against its Arab enemies. So it's a very modern militarized nation that has something like the Iron Dome versus what is essentially an open air prison, which is Palestine, which has economic embargoes, is not recognized by major nations, has kind of been forgotten by its Arab allies. Like, that's another thing we mentioned before, which was we talked about when Trump was still president, the deal that they had set out, and how Israel was talking more with its Arab buddies, and how Jared Kushner has been kind of maneuvering in between Saudis and Israel for like business deals, right? And so Palestine was getting put to the wayside, even as Arab leaders were doing deals with Israel, right? So it's asymmetrical. It's like China versus a Tibet. And not look, that's a terrible example. That's a whole different. That was a really bad example. That's a whole different political thing. But just in this sense of size and scale of military might versus an economic power, there's a huge difference. So yes, Hamas is a terrorist group that is unfortunately willing to allow its own people and civilians to die for their political gain. But still, Israel is still the one pressing the trigger to shoot that airstrike and kill innocent civilians, and use police and riot force to kill civilians. So much so that we've had tens of thousands of Palestinian casualties in the last year, and only 200 to 300 Israeli casualties in the last years in that same time period. So there obviously is a difference in the effectiveness of the combat being thrown out.
Yeah. And yeah, no, I mean, you bring up a really interesting point there is that I think one of the biggest issues, like going to the kind of Arab side of it and more the Middle Eastern side of it in general, is that the Arab world is super chaotic in terms of like allegiances, religious faith, and they've never been really a unionized force against like something like an Israel invasion. And so like, I mean, I think it was in what 1917 or something when there were first talks of partitioning part of that region for Israel, and then obviously it was after World War II and it finally happened. But the Zionist movement was growing for a long time, and
Mm.
it And Palestine was always there, but Jordan was actually supposed to partition off parts of it for Jordan. Like they were supposed to establish a Jewish state that would have parts called, I think it was the Triangle communities that would fall under Jordanian control. But then after the war of 1948, Israel took them back. No one stuck up because Jordan, to be honest, doesn't really care about Palestine. Egypt definitely doesn't care about Palestine. Egypt, actually, in the long run, has become an ally of Israel. A lot of these things, from the Oslo Accords to the Camp David Accords, Egypt's been kind of the main voice for the Arab world at the table, not Palestine. And so it seems to me that this was done with kind of a Western bias. Israel from day one had the West and kind of the imperial forces at the time on their side.
Yes.
And like I'm not saying, because I do believe in a Jewish state needs to exist, and it makes sense in some ways and doesn't in others why it was put there. For obviously religious reasons, it makes sense. And I have always supported the Jewish cause in terms of that, but it just seems like it was very lopsided, and they should have actually agreed on two states back then. Because since then, it's escalated to the point where they're not talking anymore, and it seems like it's just every 4 to 5 to 10 years, there's just this reiteration of violence because the Arab community, like you said, doesn't seem to care about Palestine. And I used to think that the
Arab leaders.
Yes, you're right. You're right. Yeah. Sorry to misquote that. The Abraham Accords, which Jared Kushner kind of spearheaded, what I think was I want to say last summer. I was wrong. I thought it was actually a good step towards communication between Israel and states like Qatar. That did not happen. I would actually think that it was the neglect of Palestine during these agreements that kind of have led to this. Also, Trump's foreign policy kind of gave Benjamin Netanyahu the green light to do what he wanted.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, every American president more or less has been buddy with Israel, but Trump didn't seem to care about the international law and the international implications of just these expanding territories. Moving the consulate to Jerusalem was probably the worst thing you could do. And so I was reading something in the New York Times where a lot of like ex-diplomats and foreign Obama administration officials, etc., think that it was actually the moving of the embassy mixed with Trump's just kind of blind look at Palestine that didn't help this. And to be honest, Biden doesn't seem to want to be involved in this either. I've seen people call him a white supremacist. That's not true, I don't think. But it is true that he does really want to stay out of this. And I think it makes sense because it's political suicide, whether you side with kind of the AOC squad group or if you side with the other more pro-Israel side, you don't win. So I get it. But I think Biden's going to have to actually take a harder stance. Like even George W. Bush was willing to condemn Israel and some expansion back when he was president. Obama tried, Trump didn't, and I think Biden's going to have to step it up, unfortunately.
Yeah, it is kind of like a presidential dead man zone, like a no man's land.
Yeah.
Like, we had if you look back at like almost every president. I mean, obviously there's no peace in the Middle East, so every president that's tried, and the thing is, a lot of presidents have made it a point of their presidency. Bill Clinton famously is one of them that was trying to make it a point to do peace in the Middle East. Had the Camp David Accords in 2000, or the Camp David Summit, sorry, and it didn't work. Um, um, and we can get into a little bit of why that didn't work. But like George Bush, tried to do some talks, didn't work. Obama didn't work. Trump even mentioned in his campaign that he wanted to have peace in the East like never before, like peace you've never seen. It didn't work. And so, strangely, yeah, like you said, this Biden's actually been pretty quiet about it because I think he understands that it's why would I make it a staple of my campaign if I just know that it's not gonna it's just
Mhm.
it's a no man's land. It's a dead zone of political success. So, but now he's thrust into it. This is like the crisis you don't prepare for, right? Like he just got COVID under control, and bang, here you go again. Israel and Palestine. Good luck. Um, and I did notice that his rhetoric is pretty tame, like you mentioned. I think he said because again, like I do believe that Israel has overreacted with their airstrikes hitting Associated Press buildings. We've now had 200 people in Palestine killed. I mean, we don't hard to confirm those numbers, but that's what we've been hearing, including a dozen plus children. Like Jesus, man. Like obviously, whatever you're doing, like whatever your retaliation should be, because I do agree you have to defend yourself and fight a terrorist group. It should not include a dozen kids getting blown up. Because guess what? That's going to lead to more Hamas fighters. Like, that's literally just a bad strategy on top of being a human rights violation and a war crime. So, but that's what's happening. And Joe Biden has mentioned that he thinks that there was not an overreaction by Israel, but he's monitoring the situation and wants to talk to Netanyahu. And you're like, damn, that's pretty tame from someone like you said, that even George Bush has condemned Israel. That's pretty tame.
It is, and I just think the Democratic Party, this actually could be a giant schism in it, just between kind of I want to say the younger, more progressive wing
Yeah.
and the older, more establishment side. And it's definitely a discussion that's going to be had, I'm sure. I do see Biden's probably going to have to change his rhetoric eventually because let's be honest, if anyone's going to listen, it's like listen about this crisis, it's going to be it's going to have to be us.
Yeah.
I just think again that like the other side of this problem, and I just really quick wanted to talk about Mr. Yasser Arafat, who because I think he's an example of what could happen if there was more discussion, but also how you fail at having a discussion. Because to me, it seems like Palestine is broken. Like Abbas has, like I said earlier, he's in 17 years of his first 4-year term. He's not giving up power. He's super old. I think he's like 90. And
I love I just love the way you put that. 17 years into his first 4-year term.
it was not me that said that. I forget where I saw it,
It's
but
clever.
but yeah, I mean, like let's be honest, Hamas and Hezbollah are the alternative to the Fatah party, which Abbas I think is the leader of. He's at least the prime minister there. But the problem is that there's like not really much of an alternative, and
Right.
so like it's kind of like what is next. And Yasser Arafat, I actually find fascinating because he was the chairman of the PLO, or the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and he was involved for a long time, from '69 to 2004. I think he died in 2004. And he actually was probably the closest in Palestine to getting to some form of negotiations. And there was respect from Clinton and the Israeli side and the Egyptian side, mainly because this guy first identified that Israel exists, but he also actually respected the idea of a diplomatic Palestine. He did condemn a lot of the Hamas fighting going later on, but he was careful not to just condemn it. He wanted to more like muddle the waters and actually challenge people to question, why do you keep doing this? And so he became a symbol of actually like maybe hope. The problem is there's a great article I was reading that talked about how he was so obsessed with being a symbol and part of the negotiations that he was never willing to actually go forward in ending the crisis. And so he would kind of like, give small concessions, which happened with Clinton in the Camp David summit. And also Oslo, is that he would give small things, but it was never something that was seen as long term or lasting. But I think it does give a framework for you don't condemn the anger of Hamas or Hezbollah or these other groups, but you do say that we can't go on by blowing stuff up.
Yeah.
We have to go on by identifying that we're going to have to exist one way or another. Now, again, Israel's gone much more extreme since then, but I think the problem is there's no one like an Arafat who ended up winning the Nobel Peace Prize along with the Egyptian leader and the Israeli leader is at the time. And he at least had an idea, and the problem is Abbas is old and seems to just be kind of an autocrat, and Hamas just hates Israel, let's be honest.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's
It
all I
does-
got there, but yeah.
It does seem like that Camp David summit was the closest we got,
Mhm.
and it failed, and now they're farther than they were then. I think Arafat even mentioned to Bill Clinton that said, "You're a great man," and Bill Clinton said, "No, I'm not. I would have been, but you ruined it." Like I was about to I was about to be the president that brokered Middle East peace, but you weren't serious enough. What's interesting is
Mhm.
What's also interesting about that Camp David summit is how unpopular the concessions were that Israelis gave up in the talks that eventually didn't happen, but how at that time as well that the Israeli side, the government at least, was as willing to give a lot of things up that the Israeli people were not, just to get on the table, just to bring it to the table, and it still fell through. I mean, the Palestinians on their said they would say that there's issues of sovereignty and security that fell those talks apart. But it does seem like so obviously, I'm sure it's a little bit of both, but historically it does seem like US and Israel were more willing to come to an agreement in that 2000 summit specifically at that time than Palestine was. But then now today neither side is not even close to that point. Like Netanyahu's not that close to that point. Like I don't think a Camp David summit could happen right now at all. And that's sad because it was as close as we think we could have gotten in recent history, and right now we're farther than ever. Even though we had this lull for a bit, for like 4 to 6 years, I think it's now worse than ever. And yeah, and I wanted to just mention, before again, like, because I don't think we're going to solve this problem tonight, certainly not. But I do want to mention that the great Atlantic article you had mentioned. This is, keeping everyone's idea of biases and whatever. This is Maddie Friedman, a Canadian Israeli reporter who's for the Atlantic, but at the time he was for the Associated Press between 2006 and 2011 in the Jerusalem bureau, and how he talked about, there was a culture, a perspective and a culture around reporters that was not necessarily objective, that in his mind. And I encourage you to, because I think it's going to be too much and too in the weeds for us to delve into right here all the way. But I really encourage you guys to read this because it's an interesting perspective. But I think there's some really interesting takeaways that's important, and it reminds me a lot of my studies in anthropology, right here, where it's. So many photographers cover protests in Israel and the Palestinian territories, for example, that one of the challenges for anyone taking pictures is keeping colleagues out of the frame. Like there's so many reporters and photographers, you struggle to keep them out of your frame. That the other photographers are as important to the story as Palestinian protesters or Israeli soldiers. This does not seem to be considered. It's almost like, what role does all these reporters and NGOs and different eyeballs being there have on how people react or portray themselves? It's very similar to in anthropology when studying a culture, outside of a context of like a conflict or a war, just studying a culture. There's this idea that perhaps even just being there as an anthropologist taking notes might change the behavior of the people you're studying, or there's an interesting relationship that's not necessarily bias free, right, that you have to keep in mind. And I think that's super interesting when it comes to Palestine because of what that is that Hamas understands the media narrative, and if they're willing to portray themselves in a way that can garner international support, and while ignoring their own faults, that's beneficial. The guy in the Atlantic claims that happens, where Hamas would threaten journalists to write stories, and then they wouldn't report on that.
Yeah, and it actually kind of goes full circle back to kind of our talk about the asymmetrical response and just the asymmetrical carnage. Is if you're a journalist on the ground talking to NGOs that usually are doing a good thing, trying to just bring aid to people in need,
right,
the Palestinians are being asymmetrically impacted by the violence.
Absolutely.
Even if sometimes they've started the violence. And that's the problem is that if you're on the ground just seeing that shit happen day in, day night, you're going to be an advocate for human rights. And sometimes that's without looking at the broader picture. Like you said, without going too far into the article, because it's definitely a lot. There's a university in 2014 where there was an image of this Islamic Jihad group. These students who supported it were basically doing Heil Hitler's, I don't even know what that's called, the straight arm thing. I don't know. And the article makes clear these are not Nazis. But there's this hate towards Israel that it showed in that photo, but the media didn't cover it. But it also shows why Israelis are so terrified of this image of what their surrounding neighbors think of them. And so it's kind of a chicken or the egg thing at that point to me. But it really does show how I think that even though like the NGOs and humanitarian aid are doing the right thing, journalists need to be removed from that. But like you said, if you're there on the ground, it's really hard to do so. And that's why, like, over the last week, I've just seen so many social media posts that are just like F Israel or F Palestine. And it's just like, this is so much more complicated than that, like, unfortunately, I think it was a lot of mess ups during the Truman years and prior that we should have solved a lot of this a long time ago.
Yeah, I mean that's the absolutely. I mean this conflict goes way deeper than even 2014 or
Hmm.
2000 or before then, right? But um, I just do think it's important to realize, like, just to keep that in mind of that idea of what does so many reporters and journalists being there, being involved in NGOs do to the integrity of journalism. Now, I'm not saying that we should just ignore the reports coming out of Palestine. I'm not saying that at all. I think we should give them more attention. But it is worth knowing that, like, yeah, like Hamas understands what media narrative is. To think that they're not like, think that they're like, think that they're to think that the media's role is completely separated from what's happening, I think is um, naive. I think we now understand that media's role is more than ever tied into political success. That we have to just keep that in mind when looking at coverage of something so sensitive and so politically divisive around the globe.
Absolutely. I totally agree, and yeah, we are not going to solve this here, but I think this was at least, it shows to a lot of people who I think are just seeing the lack of nuance going on that, yeah, there's a lot that needs to be done. And I do think that Biden is going to be kind of opening up and seeing the light with some of this. But we shall see. We shall definitely see. Before we're out of here, should we maybe end with a few light topics? I don't know. Kind
Sure,
of,
sure. Round robin. What's some of the other stuff that you got? What's on your mind?
well, there's two things with the Republican Party: the commission,
Oh, right.
and Matt Gaetz. So maybe
Yeah.
we could cover those two real quick. And yeah. So first on the commission, the House actually has agreed to open up a commission for a 9/11 style commission looking into the facts and circumstances that happened on January 6th. And I think
Mm.
from day one, you and I have welcomed this, right? And you said it so well. I think it was you who said it, where you were like, how do we move on from something if we don't know, if we don't have accountability, we don't know the answers, we don't even know the roots of this problem, right? And so, yeah, I think this is great. Kevin McCarthy said he's against it. I did mention last week that it seems like he may have some ulterior connections with people that were actually involved in maybe stirring the pot for this riot. So I think a lot of these Republicans don't want to be held accountable for this because they've said so much bullshit over the last couple months.
Yeah.
What's that guy's name? It was like Clyde, Congressman Clyde from Georgia. He called this a tourist visit to the White House. But then if you or the Capitol, sorry, but then if you look at him on January 6th, new video footage shows him literally like trying to barricade his door and
He's cowering
screaming
for his
like a total
life.
wimp.
He's cowering.
Yeah.
He's cowering for his life behind a security guy with a gun, and then later goes on to say, "Oh no, pish posh! It's a tourist. It was a tourist visit."
Like bullshit, man. And it pisses me off that my own party, I still somehow am holding on to that they are so like hell bent on erasing the cultural narrative and the cultural memory of what happened on January 6th. I mean, man, we're only what 4 months removed, and already the narrative has changed, and it's like this country will probably never be the same unless we address this issue.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think. I mean, it's changed for like Trump fans that are, I think, completely out devoid of reality. Anyway, like the QAnon types, like people are really down the deep end. They're never gonna. They're like, there's nothing you can do anyway, right? Like January 6th was fun. Like they could have. They were. There's literally people that were there on January 6th that did do illegal things and then say things like, "Well, but the worst guys were Antifa," and you're like, "There's nothing you can do." I mean, it's like, it's like fighting. Like don't bother arguing with an idiot. He'll just beat you with experience. Um, but I think for the majority of Americans, I don't think that this narrative change has worked. I don't think it's a good long term strategy, and I think for like a lot of independents and stuff, that was still a day where, like, yeah, that shit got crazy, and I don't think that the like it's only convincing Republicans that are easy to convince anyway. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I mean, I really hope you're right. I'm a little more skeptical, just
Yeah.
because the problem is that they're basing the whole 2022 kind of 2024 narrative around maybe this wasn't that bad.
Right.
And if you're like, the problem is, again, the mainstream right wing media has bought into this. That, like, I haven't seen Fox News actually say it was a tourist visit. Okay, you're right that the crazy ones are saying that, but I've heard the Dan Crenshaws, the Ben Shapiros say that, okay, this wasn't the worst thing that's ever happened. And it probably wasn't the worst thing that's ever happened, and because, it wasn't a 9/11 or a Pearl Harbor where just so many people died. But it was the worst thing possible for the, like, sanctity of one of the oldest constitutions and one of the oldest democracies in the world. And the problem is like, I don't think you can talk about the big lie without this. And the thing is, they keep evolving side by side.
Yes.
And like, that's what worries me, is that these Republican congressmen, mainly congressmen, luckily a lot of senators haven't, except for Ron Don, or Ron and On as I call him sometimes, Ron Johnson out of Wisconsin. He's, said the same thing. He's like, they're good, white working people that went there. And but the thing is like, it's crazy, man. And they're ousting people from leadership. They're ousting people in the narrative that just say it's crazy. I mean, Mitt Romney's the what's his name? There's this Upton guy from Michigan. He said, "Okay, we were actually scared, and you guys need to talk about this bogus differently." And Liz Cheney, I mean, that's the issue, is that right now it's in its infancy, but it's like all the sane people are going, man.
No, you're right. You're right. The Republican Party is doubling down on crazy. That's for sure. I just don't. I just don't see it. I just don't see it being. I don't see the narrative being so powerful that it changes the history books. Like, I think the history books will still say, no, this is an insurrection against the Constitution. These people were, like, committed, like, an anti-constitutional act by, like, trying to stop our government from peacefully transferring power, and then they were influenced by a propaganda machine that propped up an idiot. Like, I have confidence that the history books will accurately reflect what happened on January 6th, or at least to a point. Whereas I don't think all Americans in the future will see it as, no, nothing bad happened. I think it's a strategy by Republicans to win in 22, absolutely, and it's might work. But damn, man, I mean, like, I'm glad we're having a commission to bring it back to light. I'm glad that there's the conversation around making this commission to bring back the truth around this conversation. Because, again, I don't think the narrative will win out in the long run. In the long run.
Yeah, no, I mean, I definitely hope you're right. My bigger worry is, like, what happens if it happened again.
Yeah.
And I think it will in some form or another. I'm surprised it actually didn't happen in more state capitals. But
Well,
yeah,
I
like,
mean, again, I mentioned this last time we talked about kind of this topic was how does a Democrat ever win again without Republicans claiming foul?
exactly. Exactly. And that is to me, the more scary part is, I mean, it's just, this was kind of the first step, right, towards kind of discrediting democracy. And so for me, it's like, if one side is ignoring the severity of that, it makes it easier to do it again.
Yeah, yeah.
So, but Matt Gaetz, how about him?
But Matt Gaetz, I mean, look, Matt Gaetz is screwed. We keep learning more and more about this scandal about paying minors for sex, illegal prostitution, pedophilia. Like, I mean, just like a sex trafficking pedophile. That's the allegations against Matt Gaetz. A lot of those allegations were also put against one of his buddies. What's his name? Why am I blanking on his name? Let's see. It's like
Something Greenberg.
something. Yeah, everyone keeps saying Matt Gaetz associate because his name is so forgettable. Joel Greenberg.
There we
Joel. So Gates associate pleads guilty to 6 federal crimes, including sex trafficking a teen. So this is one of Gates's, like, good buddies, and who's also included on some of the same allegations. So the fact that now his are true means that, like, and that he pleads guilty. Not only that it's that like he's actually getting charged, that he's pleading guilty and cooperating with prosecutors. From what I hear, if his cooperation goes through, he could reduce his sentence from 30 something years down to 6. So cooperating with what? What might he be cooperating with to reduce his sentence? Obviously, someone else is on the ticket next to get arrested. And the talk of the town is that it's Matt Gaetz. And the talk of the town is that this Gaetz associate is going to be working with the feds to help fry a bigger fish, and Matt Gaetz is that bigger fish. I think this guy's really screwed. I don't from what I hear and how seriously the Department of Justice seems to be taking it. I think this guy's probably enjoying his last few months in freedom.
The guy's a total jerk. Yeah, I mean, yeah, like you said, I mean, Greenberg, the fact that he, allowed this to happen, the fact that he confessed about this, he's already seeing some very serious prison time. And so the fact that he's, implicating Gates here it is quite serious in my book. Um, the crazy thing is that I watched Gates. I think it was last weekend. I want to say at one of those Republican Women for Trump conventions, and the guy's gone like total MAGA hat, like Trump hairdo. Like he's emboldened by it, man. And it's ironic because he's calling it some deep state hoax, but it was the Trump Justice Department that started these investigations.
Right,
So,
right.
and but to me, like I guess full circle back to Liz Cheney, who I'm not even a fan of, but like it's just funny how the Republican caucus and the House Republican leaders are so focused on her because she's ruining the narrative of the election being stolen. When I mean, he is potentially a child sex trafficker and a pedophile.
Yeah, again,
And
remember when the Democrats asked what's his face? Al Franken
oh,
Al
yeah,
Franken had to leave his career because of a like admittedly a bad joke, but a bad joke. Well, Matt Gaetz gets to still tour with Marjorie Taylor Greene on their little America whatever. Actually, I think they might have canceled that, but
I hope so.
like he's still highfalutin around as a politician with no word from the Republican Party. I mean, talk about a big tent, right? Big tent is apparently not big enough for Liz Cheney to criticize Trump once, but the tent is big enough to include a pedophile.
It's disgusting, and to be honest, I really don't know. I mean, there will be probably justice in terms of Gates could go to prison,
Oh yeah,
but I don't know if there will ever be accountability. Because I think Republican, not again, I'm not trying to say all Republican voters, but I think the people that have bought into him and Marjorie Taylor Greene and Trump's big lie, they're just going to see this as another kind of emboldening moment. So it's really depressing. It's really depressing to me because this
yeah.
guy, I mean, this guy's just a sleazeball, man, and he just reminds me of every like bully you could see in like a '90s high school movie.
He's almost like it's almost like too much of a caricature of like Matt Gaetz is what like blue-haired Twitter Democrats think every Republican congressman
Yeah.
is, like a frat bro, cocaine, snorting a-hole who you know, openly votes against like benefits for women and sex workers, but then hires sex workers. Like he's like the nightmare that every liberal thinks all Republicans are. Um,
Yes.
which is of course not true. Like not all Republicans are like that, but he fits the bill as like yeah he's from fucking Florida, like he literally is that Florida douche. And I hope he goes to jail. I hope he goes to jail really bad. I can't wait. Yeah, but his good buddy Joel Greenberg, who is like has partied with him, is definitely going to jail and has reduced his sentence from 3 decades to about 6 years because he's helping the feds. He's snitching. So we'll see what 6ix9ine over here does for his buddy Matt Gaetz. And yeah, it should be fun to watch that story unfold. Obviously, jokes aside, I mean, we're not joking about the acts. Obviously, the victims, are probably traumatized, and this is super serious.
Justin,
But
yeah.
yeah, but screw these guys. So I'm definitely down to make fun of them and their downfall. So another hopefully fascinating and across the board interesting episode of the Tonic Accord. We talked a little bit about the emergence and mainstream media of UFOs. We talked a little bit about the CDC changing their mask policies. Obviously, our main segment tonight was about Israel and Palestine and how we need to be careful about the way we, consume information around really sensitive topics, and also looking at the history around those two nations. And then top it off with some good old Republican drama with some the big lie election fraud news and Matt Gaetz having probably a bad couple weeks. Thank you all for listening to this episode, and we'll see you next time.
Or a bad 30 years for Matt Gaetz.
Yeah, true.